Well, good evening. Happy Sabbath. No, it's not Sabbath here yet. So I welcome you to, we're doing this, the reading of God's celestial clock. And of course, this is our Friday night vespers. And I know I do a lot of reading. Now, part of the reason that we're doing this, probably the main reason, is that it's nice to get feedback about the book and suggestions. And I know it's difficult sort of to give feedback on something like this. One is you can't hurt my feelings, so you don't need to worry about that. But also it's just, whether you understand something or not, whether I've written it well, explained it well, and it has been helpful in the earlier studies. It's really helped me sort of figure out how to pace this story. How to write it. And so I keep going back and editing earlier material, trying to get a consistent style. But anyway, before we get into reading this, we're going to have a word of prayer. And, we need to be praying for one another. And I know many people pray for me and my situation, and I pray for you guys. But we know there's lots happening in this world, lots happening in this movement, in the church. And we need to, once in a while people write me and say they're praying for me, and I always really appreciate that. Some of them don't even really know, what's happening in my life. I had people I haven't talked to for a long time, old friends, but they just feel the impression to pray for me. And, often I have an impression to pray for different people. And I believe those impressions come from God, even if we don't know the situation. So we need to pray for one another and to pray for the studies, all the things that we're learning. As you know, I get sometimes a little weighed down with the responsibility that we have and trying to figure out how much responsibility we have to share things. It's like, we can't do everything. So we have the things that God puts before us to do. And so each of us needs to recognize what it is that we can do. So anyway, let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so grateful that you have created this world, that you've created each one of us, and that you have sent your Son to die for us, and that you've given us your word to speak to us, that you've created the things in nature that reflect your character and your purposes. And we're thankful for the Sabbath, the time in which we get to enjoy nature and to spend time with you and in time of fellowship. We know for many of us, we don't have the fellowship of a local church, and that our fellowship sometimes, even though it's at a distance, is still a huge blessing. You know the needs that each of us have in our lives. You know the failings and the struggles that we face. And you know the disappointments that we experience. But we know, Lord, that you've allowed all of these things for a purpose. And we just pray that we can understand your purpose in our lives and that we can obey your voice. Be with us as we spend time together this evening as our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So, as I was saying, I do all of this editing. So I'm writing these chapters, and I'll just explain a bit about this. That it's a bit of work. I do enjoy parts of it because every time I write, I learn, and I'm trying to learn how to communicate. And this, of course, has been the story of my life. How do you communicate ideas that we have in a way that people can understand them? So the idea of this book, and when the final form of this book is going to be, some poetry in it, and some narrative, some technical aspects, prophecy, but much different than my theological papers, which are a bit more dry. These are meant to be a bit more inviting and to bring things bit by bit. So the purpose of we're going through these calendars is because these calendars are going to be used in prophecy. And so I'm touching on these different ideas. So in this section dealing with the Babylonian calendar, I have to think of, what am I going to say? I could just write a dry thing about the Babylonian calendar and how it worked, but here I'm going to be using, Ezekiel. And so I added a bunch of things which I'm not quite sure that I should have added. So this is kind of the mashed together version of everything I wrote instead of my edited version. And that's because the edited version left out a lot of stuff that I wasn't really sure that I should have left out. So whether I should have everything in here or not, we can comment on it as we go along. Okay, to understand the Babylonian calendar, we must go to the place where it first intersects with the biblical one, the banks of the River Chebar. The slow water inscribes its mark, and I thought I put slow flowing water. I like that better. The slow flowing water inscribes its mark along the western border of the empire. And there stands Ezekiel. That's a typo. Let me see here. That's not right at all. Here, I'm going to go back. See, that one I didn't edit. I'm going to go back to the edited version. You'll read, because that one's just really messed up. I don't know what happened there. Okay, here, we'll go to this one. To understand the Babylonian calendar, we must go to the place where it first intersects the biblical on the banks of the River Chebar. The slow flowing river inscribes its mark along the western border of the empire. And there stands Ezekiel. See, this one still has the same problem. What did I do wrong here? There stands, I typed in something that didn't make sense. So maybe I'll go back to the other one. So they both have the same sentence that doesn't make any sense. Okay. So, yeah, so that's not what I wrote there. I don't know. Okay. Sabbath kept offering a small relief from the seat seat. There was a whole section that I wrote that's all just cut out. I don't know what happened to it. Here, I'm going to see if I can find it. Sorry about that. Okay. So I'm going to go back here. I have this in this other document. Yeah, this is like a whole section. Because anyway, how did I write that? What ended up getting cut out? Okay, so somehow I ended up getting rid of that. I don't know if I could go back. Okay, anyway, I'm going to have to re-edit that. So the idea here is, I can copy this part. There we see the prophet Ezekiel gazing out across the water, his feet cooled by the soft mud of its banks, and a small relief from the moist heat of the midsummer afternoon. We can almost hear his inner ponderings as he reflects on the events that carried him into exile with the Jewish captives, among whom was their king Jehoiachin. Now, he's keeping the Sabbath here. So that is what I had put in. I had put in, because this is going to be a Sabbath, this day that he's there. So there we see the prophet Ezekiel keeping the Sabbath, right? So somehow, I don't know how that got messed up, but I'll put that back in later. And that's an interesting point, this date that he is going to have this first vision. But we'll see this. Maybe it shows up later on. I did so much editing. But the idea here is we have this point where the Babylonian and the biblical calendar interact. And that's in the book of Ezekiel. And so I can introduce some aspects of Ezekiel's prophecies without going into detail. So I'm planting seeds for later on. This scene is not invention. The Babylonian Chronicles record Jehoiachin's captivity in a document known as ABC 5. That's the Assyrian Babylonian Chronicles, I think is what ABC stands for. In the 7th year, 598 to 597, the stuff in brackets is not in the original cuneiform tablet, but the other things are. In the month Kislevu, the king of Akkad, which is Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, mustered his troops, marched to the Hatti land, that's Palestine, and besieged the city of Judah on the 2nd day of the month Adaru, and that's March 16th, 597 BC. He seized the city and captured the king, Jehoiachin. He appointed there a king of his own choice, Zedekiah, received its heavy tribute, and sent to Babylon. So it's interesting that in the Babylonian Chronicles, it tells you what the Bible tells you, that Nebuchadnezzar comes and he's going to capture the city of Jerusalem and take the king Jehoiachin captive and put his uncle Zedekiah on the throne. It doesn't say that his name's Zedekiah, right? It just says the king of his own choice, right? But we know it's Zedekiah. His name was originally Mattaniah. Okay, so that's in the Babylonian Chronicles. We return to Ezekiel deep in thought, reflecting on the day he was carried from his home. In his mind, he is still walking, still hearing the clatter of chains and tasting the dust of that long, stifling journey from Jerusalem. He cannot forget. The date had been pressed into his memory like the cuneiform of the Babylonian scribes into clay. While the Babylonians wrote this date into their chronicles, Ezekiel had etched it into his bones. Ezekiel, along with his king Jehoiachin, had been taken captive when the city of Jerusalem fell to the Babylonian armies on the second day of the month that the Babylonians call Adaru. However, to Ezekiel, it was the 12th month, as counted from the first month of the Hebrew calendar. His thoughts then turned to the present date, the 5th day of the 4th month, known to the Babylonians as Tammuz. The month reminded him of the Babylonian god after whom it was named. Tammuz, the dying god of vegetation, whose fading strength was traced in the dimming of the summer stars, a god who perished with the heat and returned with the rains, a god whose story rose and fell with the fields. Ezekiel saw in this god a counterfeit of the true God. The contrast to him was sharp, yet how easily such a tale had drawn the hearts of some of his own people. He had seen the women in Jerusalem weeping for Tammuz at the very gates of the temple. Their tears had not been for the God who created the heavens, but for the God who merely mirrored their cycles, a God who died every year, a God whose weakness was carved into the constellations. To Ezekiel, the story was a mockery of the promised Messiah, a parody of redemption, a nature God set against the Creator, who neither fades nor returns with the seasons. Later he would see this again in vision, and the judgment of God upon such false worship. For now, to consider the month named after such a God, to live in a land where time itself bowed to a dying deity, was to feel the weight of exile in his very breath. Something felt different. Was God soon to act? The sky and its celestial occupants were, to the Babylonians, gods. The heavens they had divided, named, and domesticated were governed by astrologers who used them to divine what the gods might do. Their calendar was a medium of control. For Ezekiel, to be brought into a land whose calendar paralleled his own, yet differed so greatly in character and purpose, must have been unsettling. What was about to happen was in answer not just to Ezekiel's thoughts, but to his daily prayers while in exile. It had been more than 5 years since he had been carried away. While he waited, he prayed. On this Sabbath, I've just breathed in the wrong way. Something stirred in his heart. Okay, so I do mention the Sabbath here. So this is the Sabbath. Okay, the gathering dust. So anyway, just the introduction there. If anybody has any comments about it, it's just, I know I kind of broke it up a little bit. It's not really flowing because of all the interruptions, but if you have any suggestions about it, I'd be happy to hear it. I think it's okay. Give a thumbs up. But the idea, is that we see Ezekiel, we kind of get the person's mind drawn into the story. While the present date, the 5th day of the 4th month, lay in his mind like a weight, his attention was suddenly drawn to something stirring on the distant horizon. At first it was only a smudge, a low, tawny blur, the color of beaten copper. Ezekiel squinted. The rising dust suggested a caravan coming from some far country, perhaps even from Judah, or maybe an approaching army. But the dust did not behave like dust. It brightened. A glow rose within it, a strange metallic radiance of Hashmal, the amber fire enfolding itself. The cloud thickened, drew near, and then opened. The vision enveloped him. In the heart of the fire were 4 living creatures, each with a different face: a lion, an ox, a man, and an eagle. Ezekiel knew these forms well as symbols of the Mazzaroth, right? The stars in the heaven, right? The constellations that mark the 4 corners of the sky. Figures the Babylonian astrologers studied for omens and signs. Later ages would call them Leo, Taurus, Aquarius, and Scorpio. The ancient Hebrews knew these constellations as well, but they were never meant to worship them. Yet in Jerusalem, the priests had bowed to the gods of Babylon. At first, the scene seemed a confusion of motion: wings, wheels, fire, and wind, all moving at once. But as Ezekiel watched, he sensed a perfect order beneath the seeming tumult. Nothing collided, nothing hesitated. Every movement answered another, as though each part were timed to a hidden rhythm. The wheels rose and fell with the creatures, and the creatures moved with the Spirit, and the Spirit moved with a certainty that belonged to one who governed more than the earth. Ezekiel understood. This was not chaos. This was time. Time as God held it. Time as God moved it. Time as God commanded it. The very heavens the Babylonians claimed to read were here shown to be under the hand of the Creator. The wheels within wheels were not the machinery of fate, nor the predictable cycles the astrologers charted, but the living architecture of providence. Their movements were not bound to omens or calculations, but to the will of the Spirit. The Babylonians imagined the sun carried in a chariot, a predictable servant of the state. Ezekiel saw the one who commanded the chariot and guided the planets by his Spirit. The wheels within wheels did not move according to the calculations of astrologers, but wherever the Spirit went. This was a judgment, not only upon Babylon and its gods, but upon Israel, who had departed so far from the mission God had raised them to accomplish. The siege of the body and the 391.5 gear. The vision left him trembling, but he was now given a command that was stronger still. He was to act out a parable, to demonstrate the destruction that was soon to come upon Jerusalem, its people, and its temple. He was to become a living chronometer, stretched out in the dust. God instructed him to take a clay tile, the same humble material used for Babylonian administrative records, and engrave upon it the outline of Jerusalem. He then set a siege against this miniature city, and he built a fort, cast a mount of earth, and set a camp with battering rams around about it. I think I should say a mound of earth. Okay. Finally, he took an iron griddle, a common pan, and placed it as an iron wall between himself and the city. It was a stark, tactile representation of the separation between God and his people. Instead of proclaiming a message, he was to become the message. He lay on his left side, facing the siege mock-up for 390 days. The Count felt peculiar. Why this duration? As he lay there day after day, he watched the moon rise and set, marking the Babylonian months, the 29 or 30-day blocks controlled by the king's decree. The insertion of an extra month, sometimes mid-year, under the direction of the astrologers as the second Elulu, was dictated by the king to manipulate the destiny or avoid inconvenient omens. Yet Ezekiel numbered these months according to the covenant of the Exodus. As Ezekiel counts the months and days that he is lying on his left side, he is not fully aware of the significance of his actions. Each night as he is tied so that he does not roll over and continues to face the mock-up of Jerusalem's coming siege, he is a tooth in the gear of the celestial clock. Each day marks 1 year of a period of 390 years that stretches back to the division of the kingdom of Israel and to Jeroboam, the first monarch of the northern kingdom, offering before the newly made golden calf at Bethel on a counterfeit feast day, the 15th day of the 8th month. So here I go back to that the division of the kingdom, the 15th day of the 8th month becomes important. So I figured I'd put this here. Whether I should keep that part there or not, I'm not certain. Okay. This count also stretches forward to the start of the siege by Nebuchadnezzar. It sets up a pattern which we will address in more detail later. While Ezekiel's focus is on the siege itself, hidden within his actions is the date for the destruction of Jerusalem, and specifically the temple, which occurs on Av 10, or the 10th day of the 5th month. This is the 391 and a half years from the division of the kingdom of Israel. That is, from the start of the siege on the 10th day of the 10th month to its conclusion on the 9th day of the 4th month is 1.5 years, which is then added to the 390 years. Later, we will discover that Ezekiel is living out a pattern that is numbered in the stars. As he came to the 390th day, the final day on his left side, he noted the date, the 10th day of the 5th month. Exactly 5 years later, on this date, Av 10, the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed. The next day, August 15th, 591 BC, Ezekiel turned to his right side for a further 40 days. These dates and the events attached to them are significant. We will see later why. For now, we need to delve further into the contrast between the calendar given by God and that of the Babylonians. So I'm not particularly happy with this section. I don't think it's really clear. I think I need to rewrite quite a bit of it if I'm going to use this. That is, I need to piece it out. It's like dumping too much on at once. I don't know what people think of that, but I'm dumping too many numbers all at once because they're just going to float by, right? Do people agree that there's too much?
Well, in a written form, people will be able to take their time and parse it out in their head as well. So just saying it, yeah, people will eyes glaze over.
Yeah, but see, and I don't want to lose the reader like in reading. Like I don't want to have the reader read something that he doesn't comprehend or he doesn't hold on to. I want to make sure every time I give them a piece of information that I wrap it up and put a bow on it. You know, you understand what I'm saying? Because it's easy to do.
You don't want them to have to do work. Like just it's got to come to them through what you're writing.
Yeah. Now, I want them to also discover it. That is, you know, I say I'm giving it to them as a gift, right? Wrapped up with a bow on it. They still have to open it, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, that would be reading it.
Yeah, but it's reading it, but I'm giving it to them in a piece that they can appreciate what it is, right? And so I think in the earlier part when I introduced those dates, you know, the second day of the 12th month, Adaru, and the 5th day of the 4th month, those ones work well. But when I start introducing the 10th day of the 7th month, I think or the 10th day of the 5th month, I think I'm doing too much. Like I'm drawing them back. I need to break this into pieces. I need to expand it.
Yeah, for me, first day of the 2nd month and all of these biblical references, I really don't understand what it means. To this day, I still don't get it. Spring, fall, it's something to do with that. Which month? For me, the first month is January. The Bible.
Yeah, well, the first month's in the spring. So
it's like converting. Yeah, it's like converting Celsius to Fahrenheit.
Yeah, I seen somebody, they did a chronology of the Noah's flood, and they put it on our calendar, Gregorian calendar. So they had the first day of the first month obviously would be January 1st, right? And then they had, so when it's going to be the 17th day of the 2nd month, they had February 17th, when the door of the ark is closed. And it was kind of interesting how it actually kind of fit, not completely because it's too short of a year because you need a 385-day year. They couldn't take the 250-day spans and fit them in there. But it was kind of funny how they did it. It almost seemed like kind of cute. But I'm pretty sure they must know that, they didn't use our calendar back then. but they didn't.
That's a lot of work to do and not know that. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's kind of neat. So that was like the first time I'd ever seen anybody try to work out the dates on a calendar, but it was on the Gregorian calendar. Neat. Okay. So I have this chapter called Forensic Contrast, which I'm not sure if I should use the word forensic. But anyway, there's a contrast between the two calendars. Now, a contrast is sometimes greater when there are similarities. Maybe what I should do just as a title, the contrast, same, different. That makes sense? We can do this here. I probably should capitalize, but. So it's the same, but different. So a contrast is sometimes greater when there are similarities. The Babylonian calendar is a lunar solar calendar, just as the Hebrew calendar is. The months were based on the moon, and the year was based on the sun. And a leap month was added every 2 or 3 years to keep the year in line with the seasons. They even had a spring and fall iterations of the Akitu festival, which were tightly bound to the worship of their various state deities. In fact, the Nabonidus Chronicle gives an account month by month of the activities leading up to the fall of Babylon on the night of October 13th, 539 BC, Tishri 16. This included the systematic gathering of the various physical idols throughout the realm to be brought ceremoniously to Babylon to be worshipped in the fall Akitu festival. This is the very event described in Daniel chapter 5, where Belshazzar and his lords drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. These gods that had spent over 6 months, they had spent over 6 months transporting into the city to secure their safety. Further, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against a candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote, Daniel 5, verse 4 to 5. That writing, foretelling what was to befall Babylon, was fulfilled that night. The Akitu festival context also underlies the administrative displays in Esther 1. So here again, I'm going to go to Esther chapter 1. I think it's too much. I really need to expand this whole section, the narrative. So I kind of should finish off Daniel 5 before I go and mention Esther 1. Maybe not even mention it at all. But these are these Akitu festivals. They're in the fall, right? So in Esther 1, see, and I mention it and then I don't explain it. So I think that's not very good. While we cannot go further into those specific developments here, what we can see is that the worship of the gods of Babylon, their festivals, and their calendar served a fundamentally different purpose than the religion of the Jews. The difference between the two calendars was not merely technical. It was a difference in how one knows the world. The Babylonian calendar was a tool of the state, where leap years were determined for political reasons, and time was an administrative resource to be controlled. Its religious festivals were degrading. The Hebrew calendar was tied to the covenant, illustrated the gospel, and was received rather than engineered. It pointed not to the sky as gods, but to the sky as gods. Now, what do you think of that sentence? It doesn't work well if you read it, right? So it pointed to the sky. It pointed not to the sky as gods, that is the Hebrew calendar, but to the sky as gods. And any thoughts about that line? So I think it's clever, but reading it out loud, it sounds like I'm saying the same thing. But if you see it in text, I think people will. It's supposed to be kind of like a turn of phrase. But anyway, but what is the relationship between weights, money, and time? And why is the king of Babylon judged based upon these specific weights? So you can see here, I need to rewrite this and put this order. I've got to deal with Daniel 5 by itself first, and then deal with these other things. So like putting in this mene tekel upharsin here doesn't make sense. So that's why I'm saying I have to re-edit all of this. The writing on the wall, mene tekel upharsin, is the language of the counting house. These are the weights, the mina, the shekel, and the half mina. In the stone sky of Babylon, the state attempts to control value just as it attempts to control time. The gods are brought into the city as a display of administrative wealth, yet it is this very wealth that becomes the plummet of their judgment. When a nation attempts to buy the favor of the heavens through a counterfeit calendar and gathered idols, they find the true architecture of time has a scale they cannot tip. Now, so one of the things here that I think I need to make really, really clear is because Ezekiel's dealing with the destruction of the fall of Jerusalem, right? And Daniel deals with the fall of Babylon. So do people think it would be better if I have a section dealing with Ezekiel and then a brief section dealing with Daniel as an illustration of the Babylonian, the end of Babylon? Does that make more sense? Because here I'm trying to mix Daniel and Ezekiel together. Some people might get a little bit confused. It's like when I first started cooking for my kids, I used to do what I call multi-ethnic cooking. It's not a good plan. They didn't like curried pierogies. You can't mix Indian and Ukrainian food. So I think the same thing here. I don't want to confuse people. I want to keep things a little more concise, but I started getting these ideas and writing them and then trying to figure out how to edit them. But any suggestion on that? Does that make more sense to leave Daniel out of Ezekiel? No comments on that? Well, that's what I think. So I know I have to edit this. Hidden within the final word, Upharsin, is an exact linguistic and historical convergence that Babylonian wise men cannot read. The root word is Perez, meaning divided, matching the fiscal half mina, but pronounced as Paras. It spells the Hebrew name for Persia. So, and that's why it said, Mene, tekel, Upharsin, right? And then it says, Mene, thou weight in the balances and found wanting. Let me see. How's it go? Tekel. I think it's Mina, thou weight in the balances, Tekel, thou found wanting. I can't remember how it goes. But I think I should use the Daniel section. And then Paris. And so your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians, right? So the word Persians in Hebrew is parallel to the word divided for the Upharsin. Anyway, I need to make that really clear. At the exact hour the hand writes the financial decree of division, it names the executioner standing outside the gates. We must ask, is it a coincidence that the weights of the writing on the wall totaled 2520 gerahs, the same 7 times of prophetic history? So I don't think I'm going to put that in there at this point because there's not enough background information. Okay, in later chapters, we will see that Ezekiel's 390 and 40 days do not just address the soon coming judgment against Jerusalem. They're also attached to the fall of Babylon and even become a mirror of a larger history, a bridge back to the beginning of Israel's apostasy and forward to the restoration of spiritual Israel. While the Babylonians painted the heavens on their walls to freeze eternity into a pattern they could predict, Ezekiel lay in the dirt, proving that the true architecture of time belonged to the one who set the lights in their courses. See, in this paragraph dealing with not just that he's dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem, but also the fall of Babylon, then I could move, after I deal with Ezekiel, I could move to Daniel and as another illustration. That's what I'm thinking. But yeah, it's all mixed up here. On the day of Ezekiel's first vision, as the sun sank behind the Chebar, the stars emerged, and the same stars that shone over Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would one day guide the Magi to behold Christ. Ezekiel's vision contains a thread that ties history together, guided by a celestial clock that moves with a precision no king could command. So you can see I'm not flowing smoothly into this closing paragraph of that section. So that kind of sums up what I wanted to say in that section. Okay. So now I go back to this idea of the watchman, which I have in the beginning of the book, dealing with this epistemological antidote. So this I probably need to rewrite a little bit. But understanding this architecture requires an epistemological antidote to the entrenchment of modern chronology. And I don't know if this is a good place to address it, but in the book of Ezekiel, we have this conflict, which we've been studying in the morning studies, dealing with how to measure the kings of Judah and Israel. In the book of Ezekiel, that comes into play because Ezekiel is counting the years of the captivity fall to fall as Jehoiachin's reign, and he's counting spring to spring for Zedekiah's reign. And he tells you when he's counting fall to fall when he needs to. And most people never pick up on that. So that's what this is dealing with. And I don't think it goes here in this section dealing with, because I'm dealing with Ezekiel, but maybe I would deal with this later on in the book when I'm dealing with Ezekiel's prophecies. But anyway, it says, understanding this architecture requires an epistemological antidote to the entrenchment of modern chronology. Many contemporary scholars who argue for 587 BC as the date of Jerusalem's fall struggle to reconcile the internal harmony of Ezekiel's record. They lack an understanding of how the prophet accounts for his years. They fail to see that Ezekiel counts some years, specifically Jehoiachin's reign and the connected years of the captivity, on a fall-to-fall, Tishri-based calendar, while tracking Zedekiah's structural regnal years from a spring-to-spring, Nisan-based. Okay, so that, now then the next one I'm going to go into is the Persian calendar, but this needs a whole bunch of work. I don't know if I want to read this. I did write this out. But there's a lot of it I didn't fully, I still have to research and trying to understand the Persian calendar. Now, we don't end up using the Persian calendar in any of our Bible chronology. And I need to understand this calendar a little bit better. Now, it is very similar to the Egyptian calendar, but it's, it's centered around its religion. So it has a 360-day calendar with 5 extra days added. Right? But it's not a calendar I had studied before. The main thing about the Medes and the Persians, and maybe what I'll do is I'll bring, that's what I'll do. This makes sense. I'll deal with the Persian calendar with the fall of Babylon. There we go. I can deal with the fall of Babylon and deal with the Medes and the Persians there. And that would be a natural flow. Then, so to go from Ezekiel for the Babylonian calendar makes sense, and to go to the fall of Babylon for the Persian calendar, even though the Babylonian calendar is being used there as well. I don't know what people think of that. But the thing about the law of the Medes and Persians, and what I'm trying to do with these calendars, so there's a number of things. So obviously I'm planting seeds for later on in dealing with the biblical prophecies. So that's why I wanted to deal with Ezekiel's first vision. That's why I want to deal with Daniel's in Daniel chapter 5, because I want to deal with the fall of Babylon and Cyrus. So that needs to be expanded quite a bit. But that would be the Persian calendar. We would introduce the Persians there, even though it doesn't mention the Persian calendar in the Bible. Okay. So I'm not going to read this section. So, and as I said, I didn't have much to read today. But we can talk about it a bit more, and anything else people want to talk about as well. So you guys are going to have to do some talking, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, I was going to ask you about that August 14th, 591.
Okay, so yeah, and so some of this stuff I need to make. Well, I'm going to have diagrams in here as well. So Ezekiel begins lying on his left side on the 5th day of the 4th month, which is July 21st, just as it is in Millerite history. July 21st, Boston, when Samuel Snow, that's where he rides up on the horse and gives his presentation that it's midnight, right? So that's midnight. So Ezekiel starts at midnight. And that's another thing I really need to work in, is some of this symbolism dealing with, like, I want to plant these seeds, but you can't give too much.
I was looking at your I was looking at your notes that you did in 2016, with
Yeah.
the
So what
flood.
ends up happening? So what ends up happening? He starts lying on July 21st. Now he's going
Right.
to be 390 days. So if you add if you go and we learned this in the message, right? Jeff had taught this.
Right.
How many days was there from midnight to the midnight cry? So from July 21st in Boston to Exeter, how many days? You remember?
I don't remember it, Theodore.
It's 25 days, right? So if you go
Okay.
from,
Okay.
and you just think about it, if you think about, okay, I'm going to go from July 21st and there's 31 days in July, right?
Right.
So that means I would take, 10 days there. And then to the 15th of August, that's 15 days. So 10 plus 15 is 25. If you add 25 to 365, how many days is it?
Let's
So 365 days in a year plus 25.
give me a minute. That's 90. Was it 391?
390, right?
390. Right.
25 plus 365 is 390. So that means
Okay.
he lies on his left side on July 21st, and
Right.
then 390 days later, he's going to lie on his right side, and that's going to be August
Right.
15th, right?
Right.
So he starts the 40 days at the symbol for the midnight cry, right? So he
Right.
starts at midnight. 390 days later, he's going to end up on August 15th. Now, of course, the last day that he lies down on his left side, he still has to lie down that day, right? That day
Right.
is the 10th day of the fifth month. And then the next day is, of course, the 11th day of the fifth month, but that's going to be August 15th. So, because he's only done 329 days by the time he gets to the last day, right? Once he
Okay.
finishes that last day, he'll be in the next day. so
Okay.
so that was the point, is he ends up on the 10th day of the fifth month is the last day he lies on his left side. And then the next day he lies on his right side is going to be August 15th. So we got the midnight and the midnight cry tied in there, plus the 10th day of the fifth month. And then his third vision is going to be on the 10th day of the fifth month as well. So the one in chapter 20. So this keeps pointing towards the date of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem on the 10th day of the fifth month in 586. So, but yeah, so that's a good question. And those are things like, I want to be able to put some of these little details in there in such a way, like maybe if I do something like, if he starts on July 21st and asks that question, 390 days, what date would it bring to? So that would be 365 plus 25. So you have to count 25 days from July 21st the next year, right? So those types of things are, little images and diagrams and things that I can help, the person to think it through, and not just the language, right? So if I have these little boxes, right, where you show that, how the 390 works, that might be helpful for some people. The thing is, you have to make the book that it's accessible for different types of minds, right? Because one of the things I learned, teaching guitar is not everybody does not think the same. People all have different ways in which they process information, how they visualize things. Obviously I teach adults and children, they're all different. So you want to have something for each person reading the book. I think most people can follow the story part of it, but I think when you start adding the chronological details, those things can kind of get buried if the person gets buried in them if you give them too much too quickly. So that's the thing that I'm working on with this, and I'm getting better as I'm going along, I think, at doing this, but it's gonna take a lot of work, and I'm trying to organize my life so I'm not exercising as much, but I'm gonna do more intense exercise, so I have more time to write, and of course I'll have less students in the summer, right? Because I do spend a lot of time walking, and walking's a good exercise. I was walking 25 kilometers a day, and that's a little too much. It takes like 4.5 hours out of my day, right? So I don't need to walk that much if I do more intense exercise. But anyway, that was a good comment there, William. Anyone else on any questions, any topics? Okay. But nobody has any thoughts? Okay, so I guess what we'll do is we'll leave it at that. I'll try to have a bit more to read. I do have a bit more time this week. I'm going to try to get that section rewritten and get the calendar of the Medes and the Persians, and probably even the Greek section. The Greek calendar is just kind of a continuation of the Babylonian calendar, but there are some stories I want to tell. So I'm thinking with the Greek calendar to tell the story of Esther and that battle with the Greeks. And so it's kind of doing the transition from Persia to Greece. And then the Roman calendar, I haven't decided what to do with that one, how I'm going to introduce that. But, we got Julius Caesar, so I figure it's something to do with Julius Caesar. And then we have the papal calendar. Well, that's Pope Gregory, right? So we got that. But I'm not sure how those stories, not sure how I'm going to write those stories yet. I haven't thought enough about it. And then we also have the Islamic calendar. So that follows the papal calendar, even though it was created before the papal calendar was. But the papacy was created before Islam was created. So I'm going to Rome, pagan and papal, then the Islamic calendar. And then I'm going to deal with the Mayan calendar, right? So the Mayan calendar becomes interesting as a symbol, and it's a day count calendar. So we got all these different calendars, going from the Egyptian calendar to the biblical calendar, the Exodus calendar. Then we have the Babylonian calendar. And what I might even do with that too is just show how the Jews ended up. I might tell the story of Ezra, because we got the first day of the first month and the first day of the fifth month in there. And I think that might be a good place to address how the Jews ended up with the Babylonian month names. Because in the book of Nehemiah, now in Ezra, and I'll just show you this here. So I'm going to go to my Bible. So in the book of Ezra, obviously we know in Ezra 7:9, it's going to talk about on the first day of the first month began he to go up to Babylon. On the first day of the fifth month came he to Jerusalem, right? So we know that he's counting the months just as Ezekiel does. But when we go to Nehemiah, right? So you're going to have here the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hilkiah, and it came to pass in the month Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace. So it's interesting here that Nehemiah is using the Babylonian month names. He doesn't say that it's the 9th month, right? He just says it's the month Kislev, but it is the 9th month, right? So the question is, why does he do that? And so I might address some of that. And then in chapter 2, it came to pass in the month Nisan in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the king. Now it's interesting here because Nisan, of course, is the first month, but notice these are both in the 20th year. So he's going to be in the 9th month in the 20th year, but the 9th month comes before the first month, right? So this is a good place to illustrate. One is it addresses the argument that the Jews are counting the reigns of the kings of Persia fall to fall, even though the kings of Persia count their own reigns spring to spring. And so that helps with 457. So you can see in writing these chapters dealing with the calendars, I'm also building a foundation for understanding the biblical prophecies. And that's why this is really, really important that I build the foundation properly. So if I write all of the beginning part of the book and people don't understand the calendars, they're just confused, it's not going to help them later on. Now, we see this in the various studies that have been happening within this movement. So my problem that I have with people, I have problems with people, is that we have lost the ability to reason, to think things through. We don't know how to study. And learning how to study the Bible we've all been trained wrong in education, in schools, and we usually just we've been trained to just accept what we're told, right? We're not trained to learn on our own. And because of that, people are very, very confused in this world where there's so much information. And we see this, all of this confusion about everything that's happening. People don't know how to think things through. They read things that fit in with their thinking and they just believe them. Now, it doesn't mean that everything that people believe is wrong. People can believe lots of correct things by accident, right? You just, some of the things you're going to believe are correct. But we have no way of knowing what's true and what's not true. No way of evaluating that for most people. And even for Adventists, even for, present truth Adventists, people are confused because we're used to following people instead of studying for ourselves. So as a music teacher, I've always worked on trying to teach people how to learn on their own. The purpose is not to have people dependent upon a teacher telling them everything step by step, but that they can learn how to self-evaluate, how to think things through, how to gain new information, and how to evaluate the different sources of information. How do I know if something is true? Just because I read it in a book doesn't mean it's true. Just because I tell my students something doesn't mean it's true. They have to be able to figure that out. And so that's the purpose of the book. It's really ultimately to teach people how to think so that they can study on their own and know, right? Now, remember Parminder back in 2019, he had done this presentation right after, while they were still in Germany there. And they had this question and answer. And they were really talking about methodology all the time. And somebody had asked the question, well, should we just accept what, the teachers say? Should we study these things for ourselves? And he said, no, you need to believe what we tell you because you don't know how to study. And then if you go to a proper school and you have, proper instruction, then you will agree with us because you will have the proper way of study. Now, you can see the fault with that's the papal system of education, right? You accept what your teacher says and you get brainwashed by them so that when you actually study the way they study, you'll come to the same conclusion. But that's not what we do when we study. We start, sure, there's nothing wrong with having a teacher, but the teacher is to teach you how to study, not to give you the answers, right? So, you can't just believe something because somebody tells you it, even if you like the person, right? You have to be able to reason it out. And that's what I try to do in everything that we do. It's supposed to be that the person themselves can understand it before they believe it. You shouldn't believe something that you don't understand on some level, right? You have to know that it's true. And you have to have a way of knowing that it's true. You have to know how to study the Bible, how to compare scriptures with scriptures, how to understand line upon line, all these different events, how they fit together. And so that's what we've been doing. And it takes time. Now, we know that people at the end, they will be able to learn in months what it took us years to learn. But part of that is we have done some of the groundwork for them. But also there is the events unfolding and the Holy Spirit pouring out light as we continue to move closer to the second coming of Christ. Okay, so no one else has any comments. We can close with prayer. Okay, well, let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we are so grateful, Lord, for the Sabbath, for fellowship, for the light that has come from your word. We also have a burden in our hearts for others, those that are in darkness, those that are confused, those that are suffering and hurting in various ways. And we just pray, Lord, that you can use us to minister to those around us, to point them to you, the source of all knowledge, and that we can each know you personally. We pray for the studies tomorrow. You know, Lord, that we have a burden on our heart for many of the people who come to these studies, and we just ask that you can help us in presenting these things, and that your Spirit can work in a powerful way in people's lives. So be with us. May your angels watch over us. May the Sabbath truly be a blessing, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.